So, hi everyone, my name is Farhan, and I'll be here for this round. Welcome to the finals. So on the panel with me are six amazing people. So please, can my panelists introduce themselves so we know you are here. Let's start with Collins. Collins, are you here?
I'm here, and congratulations to all the teams in the finals of the African Giant Debate 2022. My name is Collins, and I will be your panelist for these finals. All the best to all the teams. Good looking out to Team Chinedum, Team Chuma, Team Habib, and Team Serg Mascot. Congratulations and all the best.
All right, thank you, Collins. Next we have Favor. Favor, are you here?
Yes, I am. My name is Favour Jonathan, and I'll be your panelist for this round. And I'm wishing you all the very best. Thank you.
Killer.
I'm Kelachukwu Austin. I'll be your panelist for this round. I wish you guys the best.
Victor.
Owolabi Victor. I would be a panelist in this round. Good luck to all teams.
Beautiful. Then JK.
Hi everyone. My name is John-Kalio Peace. I'll be the panelist for this round. Good luck to all teams that made it to the finals.
Amazing. Thank you very much. So the motion for finals reads: This House regrets the creation of a moral and legal distinction between the use of chemical weapons and conventional weapons. In OG, we have Serg Mascot. In OO, we have Habib. In CG, we have Chuma. In CO, we have Chijioke Chinedum. All right. So, Victor, would you mind please helping us keep time? Is that fine? You can just unmute and talk now. No need to waste time typing. Okay, beautiful. Thank you. Thank
So
you. All
let's
right, so guys, without further ado, please let's remember to indicate our POI preference before we start our speech. It's highly encouraged so that we have a beautiful finals. All right, so let's have a nice round. PM, the floor is yours.
Um, okay. So I'm audible, I assume.
Yeah,
POI
you're
is
audible, sir.
POI is in the text space. Um, I'm going to prioritize POI from closing up, especially within my first 2 minutes. Uh, Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Wars happen, and when wars happen, we are most likely going to see the use of chemical weapons, mass conventional weapons in and of themselves. We think there exist basic distinctions between these weapons in the fact that we already know that conventional weapons in the vast majority of instances have things like high precision. It's easier to get a target for the use of them, and the likes of chemical weapons in themselves are very, very, very low on precision. An example is to say, oh, conventional weapons use things like GPS, right? GPS tracker. So it's very, very easy to get a target, right? In opposition to the use of chemical weapons where they are most likely used for mass destructions. An example is during World War One, we think German used like chemical weapons like the chlorine weapon, which damaged ears, eyes, caused death by asphyxiation and the rest of them. When US bombed Nagasaki, we think they used mostly chemical biological weapons, right, to create harms on these people, right? But over the years, there have been a trend of evolution with the likes of Ukraine and Russia. We think they are most likely patronizing the use of conventional weapons, most likely because we see the type of weapons Ukraine uses, the likes of the Javelin missiles, the likes of the cruise missiles in and of themselves, the likes of the Stinger anti-aircraft missiles, Soviet designed grads in and of themselves. The comparison here is to say that there already exist very few distinctions that we already established. The problem in this debate is the attempt to create an extension of those distinctions, morally or legally, That is what we regret. But they are most likely going to juxtapose the impact of these two weapons and create a level of minimal engagement of most of them. We think this is the reason why we regret. I'm going to show why our regret model works better. I'm going to take a POI now, if there's any, right? But in the absence of that, right? In the absence of that, right? We think that creation of a moral and legal distinction between the use of these weapons in and of themselves exists to probably perpetrate an impact. That is to assume that one is most likely going to have a greater impact than the other. The extension of this analysis translates to culpability when holding individuals that are most likely going to use these weapons culpable. The problem with this is that we think when you kill someone either by knife or by the use of guns, we think all death is a death, irrespective of the weapons that are used. And we hate any attempt to try and create sympathy with trying to make an excessive glorification of distincting these two things. What does this distinction most likely look like, right? The moral distinction would most likely engage trying to distinguish the use of chemical weapons to have a very, very huge potential disastrous harm in opposition to the use of conventional weapons in of themselves. The legal distinctions would come with like the identification of the use of these weapons in of themselves. Basically, the conversation on opposition then is to defend aside the basics that we already know exist in distinguishing these two ideas. Why do we think that it is okay for us to continually support the creation of any type of moral or legal distinction at a point where you are most likely going to reduce the impact that these two are most likely going to have in status quo? We think this is very, very, very problematic. First piece of engagement, right? We think that the reason why we regret this, right, and the metric of regret in this debate is very simple. At a point where there exists a limitation in terms of the impact that you're most likely going to have when trying to interrogate the use of these weapons in status quo, then we think it's very, very good for you to regret those things in and of themselves. The next thing you need to understand is that what we regret in this debate is the creation of this distinction. What we don't necessarily think that we are regretting the use of these weapons, right? We think if wars exist and there's going to be a priority on using either of the side, we don't have a problem with that. We don't necessarily have the level of control to possibly limit those impacts and analysis, right? The first reason why we regret this specifically is that the creation of a moral and legal distinction between the use of these weapons give a certain group of people a certain level of benefit, a certain level of reduces culpability on their side, because they most likely look like they have used weapons that are most likely not so terrible, especially when you create a comparative in when these weapons have been used. An example is to say that currently, during the Russia-Ukraine war, it's easier for them to say that the impact that comes with the use of this war, because in the vast majority of instances, they are using conventional weapons. They are most likely going to say, oh, we don't think the impact is going to be akin to the type that you had during World War I, or in those scenarios where they were used of chemical weapons in and of themselves. The conversation on opposition must then engage why we have to support the creation of this when we agree that the impact and the outcome in the vast majority of instances are most likely going to be the same and are most likely going to exist on the same stance. We are proud to propose.
Cool. We thank the Prime Minister for those remarks, and we invite the Leader of Opposition. Here. Hello, shall we? You can't. What is going on? I'm coming. Can somebody help me? Okay.
Try leaving and join. I've rectified it,
Everyone
Ghost.
try. Okay. Oh yeah, reconnect, Ghost.
I think.
Yeah, you're good now.
Okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1, go. Okay. Firstly, I think that the framing in this debate is very simple. One, chemical the narrative, right? How does the narrative look like? One, he says that chemical weapons is illegitimate use of warfare. It restricts its research, its development, any form of engagement within the purview of chemical weapons. It restricts its cells, right? And any form of chemical weapon increase red alerts. That means we can go at you for using it. We can hold you for human rights abuse. That's the narrative. Lastly, it says that look, panel. Lastly, war and weapons fighting is regrettable, but it's unavoidable, right? Humans have to fight war. They will keep fighting war till perpetuity. The question of this debate is in what side, right? Should one, in what side is that war moral? Lastly, I think that the creation of this particular distinction, wait, is it me or what's going on? Can you hear me? Please, I want to restart. All
Only you.
this.
It's only you, Habib. It's only you. Carry on with your speech.
Okay. Okay.
It's
So
only you.
created. Okay. Created. Please, I want to restart. I beg. I'll just please. Like I'm too
I didn't. I
disorganized.
didn't. I didn't indicate that this, you are breaking now. How about? It was
Yes,
only
but
him.
like, but it was. What constitute a rational and moral war. But it also says that see, it also says that we have to find regulation to warfare. And I think it's very important that this is very crucial. The first thing why we support this thing is that it protects our morality in war. The distinction is if you fighting normal warfare using normal weapon, right? According to Mascot, the ability of killing who you want to kill is easy, and you kill that person faster. The ability of gouging your eyes, right, targeting your nerve cells, your nervous system, your inability to breathe, the excruciating um, um, pain that comes with chemical weapon is one that is disastrous. Even if the distinction is simple, the distinction as a normal weapon is that when you are fighting somebody, an enemy, you are pointing a gun at that person as an enemy combatant. But when you are pointing a chemical weapon as the other as the soldiers, right? You are pointing a weapon to torture that particular person. You don't just want that person to die. You want that person to die an agonistic death, and that's problematic because notice the person that is in front of you, the soldier that is in front of you that you want to kill, right, is actually regrettable because he is just in the other side, right, in the other country, trying to fight the war. The issue is it's increasingly very problematic because that's the kind of thing you want to do. But lastly, you want to keep a large amount of people at the smallest amount of time, right? It simply means that you don't want them to suffer alone. You want them to have so huge losses that it kills their morale. It constitutes a fundamental attack in their humanity. You want them to lose hope, to lose every form of trust. We think that that is an illegitimate way to fight war. We think that that is a barbaric way to fight war. But lastly, due to the fact that the effect is wide and wide, it simply means you have extreme largest of civilian casualties. So you are able to break their morale by sacrificing people in the extent. We think that as a consequence, that is not a legitimate way to fight war. And we are happy with this kind of distinction. And we're happy to make it illegal and immoral. What is the impact of this? The problem is in a post-conflict society, right? It simply means you affect the landscape, the ecosystem of that particular place. Because the problem is most of those particular chemicals have huge half-life. It simply means they can last a particular time in the particular areas, contaminating food, contaminating rivers, right? Making people who pass that place sick. We think that when you fight a war and the war stops, that killing should stop at that time. We think that the perpetual killing for future sake, when you use a weapon now and the consequence is so long term, we don't think it's a legitimate war sort of warfare. But lastly, conflict resolution, right? Because we tell you the kind of picture of killing these people is barbaric, is horrific, due to media, due to things that their family might see. It simply means it's very harder to conflict, to bring war to an end, right? It's very harder to make sure that people forgive themselves. It's hard now, but it's more harder in their side without this narrative. Because this narrative prevents people from using this war. Without this distinction, you don't prevent people from using this war, right? Lastly, we think that rescuing this particular victim of war becomes harder because the problem with chemical, not only that not only that, even if a soldier is shot, you can never rescue the person, right? So the person is sure the person is going to die long agonizing death. Even if you want to rescue the person, you have to take years because you have to know the kind of chemicals, synthesize it, and all this. They don't have that kind of time. We think it's problematic. How can you create a warfare where even soldiers cannot actually be helped? We think that is chaotic. That is not something we want. At the end of the day, right, we are going to agree with opening opposition in my second speech that look, this thing they are talking about culpability is wrong, but I'm going to tell you why their house actually have enforcement issues, and there's a slippery slope that makes all these horrific things I've said in my first speech very possible. Then I'll impact it. You mean?
Okay, so Habib, thank you for the speech, but you have 1 minute more. I think the timer glitch allowed the second timer
Oh,
that will stop
excellent,
on
excellent,
time.
excellent. So, what is the impact of all this thing, right? Like, no, look, panel. The issue is opening opposition said, oh, you do not give these people the ability because you don't hold them culpable. The issue is you can't stop warfare. People have to still fight for the selfish nature of government or politicians or the fact that they want more resources. It simply means if you don't create this distinction, right? It simply means that you are going to say all weapons is bad and people shouldn't use weapons. The truth is now that is a slippery slope for using chemical weapons because there's not a special recognition for the brutality it caused. We think that these guys want to say, oh, death is death. Yes, death is arguably worse. Like death is worse, right? But we think that rape and torture, right, is arguably worse than death. And this is exactly what it is, right? When you attack somebody, not necessarily as an enemy combatant, but as the sole essence of experiencing excruciating pain that the morale of the people is going to die, right? We didn't think that it's something that you should be allowed to do. We think that this simple slope is something that is very problematic because look, the issue is enforcement on their side is going to be so fucking hard because they have to tell me why people won't have to fight war. But right now, if there's no special recognition, why wouldn't you use the best weapon you can see to actually achieve your aim? There is nothing prevent government or anybody because of their selfish motive. This prevents it. This is the only way we can prevent it. We are very happy to propose.
Cool. We'll take the leader of opposition for those remarks. Deputy Prime Minister, the floor is yours.
Okay. Am I audible?
Yeah,
All right. So POI is in the tech space, guys. CO for the last time. Accept POI. So I'm starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. So the conversation in this debate is not about whether the use of chemical weapons in themselves are bad or whether the use of conventional weapons in themselves are good. Because if that is the conversation, then you necessarily know like opening opposition is trying to like run out of the chart, right? We concede with a lot of things they say in respect to how chemical weapons in and of themselves are terrible, constitute a fundamental, more inflicting pain in times of war zones and all those type of narratives. But the conversation here is why should there be an attempt to create moral and legal distinctions between the use of these two weapons? A couple of things that were established in the PM speech. One is that we already know the basics differentiation with these two weapons, which I already established in my speech. So if these guys are still coming to talk about how chemical weapons in of themselves are terrible because rescuing soldiers within those narratives are difficult, we think we agree. We think that's also true, right? But the conversation here is in two folds. One, opening opposition does not in any way establish what this moral and legal distinction looks like on their side. Hence, it is difficult to understand what is the comparative on your side and what are you defending, because the comparative and everything you get from the leader of opposition is most likely about how chemical weapons are terrible. We think for you to judge this debate well, we necessarily need to understand from opposition what this moral and legal distinction is. Secondly, they must show that the moral and legal distinction is an extensive analysis of the basics that we already know, that conventional weapons in themselves have high precision and are more targeted, or chemical weapons in themselves have very low precision and could be more disastrous. We think that the existence of those analyses in of themselves tells you that there is a general consensus on the basic difference between these two materials. We think we need better engagement on that material. Yeah, closing up.
Extension though, but the moral and legal distinction is that we term people who use them as bad people, we can create sanctions, etc., etc. The same way is done for chemical weapons. That's just the moral and legal distinction.
Good. If that then is the moral and legal distinction, the absence of that distinction, does it mean that you won't still hold these people culpable? Or does it mean that you won't still call them back to their action in respect to the harms that they inflict? We don't think that's disingenuous. The comparative is still the same thing in terms of outcome, right? But more importantly, if this debate is about like wars and how they most likely operate, we think wars are terrible. We think the use of chemical weapons are very terrible, right? The use of conventional weapons too are something like we are not so willing to welcome, because we don't think wars are very, very good things. But at the point where they exist, we think we are most likely going to have this engagement, right? Secondly, we think what happens in modern day warfare is that you notice that there is a very, very little significant use of chemical weaponry. And the problem, the reason for this is because of the already establishing harms that it's most likely going to have. So if this debate is happening within this period, we think we need to have any extensive analysis, like any regrettable impact in terms of the possible harms that these things have inflicted in status quo. What you see mostly in the wars currently are the use of conventional weapons, because society does not necessarily like the use of chemical weapons in of themselves. The reason for this, and what justifies our regret, is that when you continually create a discussion of trying to create distinctions between these two narratives, you ultimately have no outcome. You have no fundamental impact and analysis. Like you don't have any benefits, right? At the end of the day, we think it's fundamentally zero sum, right? What that means then is we necessarily need to come to an agreement, right? That the use of this in of itself is more likely going to harm those narratives in of themselves, right? But more importantly, we think at the end of the day, right, there are basic questions we need to ask. When it comes to the morality of war, does the pain of the death matter, right, in comparative? Because if these guys say people are going to die and chemical weapons are most likely going to be so harmful of them, we think it does not still exclude the call out, the harm and trying to punish victims in those scenarios in of themselves, right? But more importantly, when you look at how wars have happened over the years, you don't necessarily need to know the extent to which they could be terrible when we use these weapons. The problem is that when you continually focus on creating these distinctions, moral distinctions, legal distinctions, to try and show how one is very, very much terrible than the other, we don't think it mitigates the use of them if states want to mass produce or use those weapons in of themselves, even though society does not necessarily like or recognize the use of them. The basic ideas you get from opening opposition is that this debate should be about in which world is war moral. We think that the morality of war is most likely going to exist either ways. So whether you create that distinction or not, we know that there are basic war rules, like you shouldn't kill civilians, you shouldn't kill children, and all those type of things. We don't think the moral and legal distinction continually extend those already established narratives that make a distinction between these two analyses in and of itself. Lastly, and very importantly, this debate must focus on the use of these weapons and whether the creation of this moral and legal distinction has done anything to change the impact on their usage. We are very proud to propose whatever.
Cool. We thank the Deputy Prime Minister for those remarks. DLO, the floor is yours.
Starting in 3, 2, 1, go. So panel, in history, right, now after this legal distinction has been created, nobody has used chemical weapon as a recent history. The person who uses Syria will literally invade that country. What does it simply mean? How does society create moral distinction? Society create moral distinction because we give something a special status that is specifically horrific. That's why we create it, right? We create legal distinction due to that fact. So we make it illegal, we make it immoral. And anybody who uses it, right, have a lot of things. Now, how does this narrative plays out? One, it simply means when you use it, we call you have bad press. Sometimes you even intervene in your country. You have severe economic sanctions. You have isolation, right? You have special negative impact. What is the impact of all these things? It simply means that it creates negative incentives so that people will not be able to use chemical weapons because of all the horrifying things they say. Because I did not really get opening government case, right? The reason why we are defending this argument or this thing today is that we like the narrative that we create this special distinction. Your house did not create this special distinction. You lump all the weapons together, right? The thing is our house, we are able to reduce chemical. You are not able to do that because I give you structural analysis why that's likely. Because when you say all weapons are bad and all weapons are immoral, and still people have to still fight war, I did not create a special status for this war, even though we can label them and say, oh, these guys are bad, they're using chemical weapons. We have no way to sanction them, right? We have no way to police them. We can't call them specially out and call them that they are also most special actors. I don't necessarily see how their case flies. The second thing you need to know is they try to talk about is reduced culpability of Russia. Look, nobody is reducing culpability in Russia. Russia is being blamed. The analysis to exert this is very, very problematic, right? I think OO tried to OG tried. Still, I don't really understand what he's saying because he's largely misleading in the impact of this thing. But lastly, right, let me give you fresh benefits why this narrative is really useful. Look, the problem with weapons that we did not create moral and legal distinctions for is that beyond the fact that they can be used in war, they can be used by normal civilians. Normal people can get guns. Normal people can get normal things that we did not put extra prohibition for, right? And use it to commit act of terrorism. The issue is when we create this inhibition, we make it very hard for normal people to get it. We prevent terrorism of a mass scale because the problem is the regular terrorism you currently get is worse off, right? But right now you get more worse impact in terms of like it is very harder to regulate the consequence of that thing. But secondly, it's very easier, right? It's very hard to stop the terror. So it simply means for weapons, right? We can stop the consequences easily. We can stop the terror. The aftermath is not that dangerous. And lastly, we think that the fact that we create a moral and legal backing to it simply means that this is a act of self-defense in itself, right? It simply means we as a society create a self-defense so that people will not use this weapon against us because we don't know when our government will want to fight or anytime we are going to fight another country. And it's good to know that if you are going to die, we will not be dying in a fiery explosion that will make our nerve system turn against us. Right? That is ultimately a good thing. If we can do that for all weapons, we would have done it, but people will still fight wars, and that's why it's the problem. POI, if any.
See, the problem with creating a moral and legal distinction is that you establish that one is basically better than the other, whereas we don't think that that should ever be the conversation. Secondly,
okay. Yeah, okay. Your 15 minutes is up. So, panel, we agree, right? We agree that to say that, yes, normal weapon is better than chemical weapon because we even want to advertise, use normal weapon because we understand that, see, human must conflict, human must fight, right? And in order to establish that fight, right, it simply means that they will use it, do anything they like. So it's other we are able to curb human excesses using the extremities of weapon and use something where we can manage the consequence or at least be able to make sure that the consequence is bad. Our world is not a utopia, right? Their world is a world that they say, oh, all weapons are bad. And that's the narrative here. That's the counterfactual. We already know that the simple utopia is problematic, right? It doesn't give incentive for people not to use these bad weapons, right? It seems like they have enforcement issues. So, like, I see no reason why, like, in their own world, like, they give any mechanism why people use chemical weapons. Because if you don't create this distinction, right? Me, I am as sad. I will just kill my people with chemical weapons, no repercussion. But if you do it in our world, we'll evade you, bomb your ass, even arrest you for war crimes. That is the kind of thing we want if you use this kind of weapon. Because they have stupid consequences, and you must have, if you do it, we give you severe punishment. And that's the thing we support.
Thank the leader of opposition for those remarks. That closes the opening half of the debate. Member of government, the floor is yours.
All right, guys, can I be heard? All right.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
this is yeah. Since this is like an Iron Person tournament, I'm just going to ask that I all the POIs are going to be left for my whip speech. I'm going to make it a press conference. All right. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Mr. Chair, all everything we get from opening opposition is around the fact that they think that conventional weapons are better than biological or nuclear weapons, right? And that is why they want to proselytize that narrative. My speech is going to show you firstly why there is nothing conventional about conventional weapons and how they are as deadly and very terrible, and we should hate all weapons as much. Understand that these light weapons, right, because conventional weapons are called light weapons, are only light in name, right, and they contribute to problems ranging from exploitation of natural resources to child soldiers to piracy, terrorism, transborder organized crime, and those kinds of things. Because of the ease of procurement of conventional weapons, it means that they are responsible for a significant amount of crimes, whether within wars or those kinds of things that we experience within society. Understand that the proliferation of conventional weapons within the international system has presented problems to the world for many, many decades, right? Because the changing nature of conventional weapons have made them a considerably more destructive force than we previously realized, right? Because with a greater killing capacity and efficacy over a much greater area with regards to research, it means that they are even like, more often than not, like, more efficient, right? I would think that there are bombs that, we can refer to as light weapons, things like landmines that are also like, weapons of mass destructions in their own right. Understand that the proliferation of conventional weapons has become an increasingly prevalent problem, especially after the end of the Cold War, altered the alliance systems, right? And demolished the need to keep technological development secret. It meant that the changing nature of warfare has also highlighted the destructive power of conventional weapons. The asymmetric quality of this current conflict makes it almost impossible to confine the effect of weaponry to the battlefield, right? Particularly because in most cases, there is never really a defined area of warfare. It means that the things that they speak of, like, war crimes and those kinds of things, are things that even within conventional weapons can actually, still happen. Pause. Now, this is to show you that conventional weapons in and of itself are things that we think that are very deadly. We have shown you a large area of harms that they cause as well. And we think that even though they might not be heavily mass destruction and those kinds of things, because of the way they are easy to procure and contribute to way, 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 way more harm to society than these kinds of things, we can create a sort of symmetry and see that they are equal. Now, what do we think that the counterfactual is? We think that the counterfactual is one where there is a compounding of all weapons, right? And a total societal condemnation of the use of all sorts of weaponry. Now, open opposition is going to tell you that, we think that wars are still going to happen regardless. So think that the fact that people are still going to steal does not mean that the state should not continually attempt to place laws that stop people from stealing or condemning steal, on the grounds of morality. I would think that it is still principally justified for us to have the total condemnation of wars and of itself and those kinds of all sorts of weapons. I would think that we think that this is something that we primarily are happy to support. But then, secondly, we think that the issue with these moral distinctions, right, these moral and legal distinctions, is that it creates a conditional legitimization of wars. It means that public sentiment is always going to be something that is going to be tempered when it is, the use of conventional weapons. For instance, regardless of all of the atrocities that are happening in Russia at the moment, there is still a significant feeling that it could get worse, right? People are going to be like, oh, thank God they're not using chemical weapons yet, or those kinds of things, right? It looks like where the US of A is going to say, oh, they are going to significantly intervene only when Russia nuclearizes the war and those kinds of things. We think that this conditional legitimization of war is something that we regret in our world, because it means that a significant amount of people are going to continually suffer the harms that we have outlined to you are very deadly with conventional weapons, right? It means that people are always going to be caught the slack in one way or the other, simply because they are not particularly nuclearizing the conflict that they exist within or not. Why do we prefer our world? Three things. The first is that we think that in our world, where a total condemnation of the use of weaponry in and of itself exists, that there is a significant amount of backlash on persons who involve themselves in wars, whether or not these wars are nuclearized or not. It means that there is a significant likelihood that whether or not you're using conventional weapons or not, there is a significant incentive, thanks to call out culture, that you're more willing to involve yourselves in diplomatic relationships, or more more tempered ways of solving whatever conflict you involve yourselves in. But secondly, on the legal perspective of what we should do, it means that because things like United Nations might not be able to particularly curb the amount of wars that happen or stop wars from happening. It means that legal representation should be, whether or not you are using chemical weapons or those kinds of things, just try to conform to the standards upon which you have set internationally for war. It means don't commit war crimes, don't commit genocide and those kinds of things. It means that whether or not you are using conventional weapons or you are using chemical weapons, we have a significant amount of condemnation for your actions, but we're still are only going to punish you when you breach those basic levels of diplomacy. Why do we think that our world is better? We think that in our world where there is not this legitimization conditionally of war, it means that society is going to have a more united response to these kinds of wars. There's going to be a more significant amount of fallout culture, one that we think that could be significantly more that what Russia is getting, right? Because what Russia is currently getting something that is tempered, and we are proud to propose.
All right, cool. Thank the member of government for those remarks. Member of opposition. Let's go.
So, guys, am I audible?
Yeah, you are.
Okay. So I'm going through some level of anxiety attack. It happens every final. So to my concern, just do here on the text space. I beg you, it's going to help me. Jesus Christ. POIs in the text space, I may not take. I'll most likely take in my whip speech. You all should listen to wisdom. Beginning 3, 2, and 1. So panel, what Up or Gov has debated is this house prefers a world where we are against wars, and this is not the debate of today. What I'm basically going to do in my speech is that I'm specifically going to engage warfare, because this is the major aspect of today's debate that should fundamentally be engaged, and I'll win on those particular things, right? Panel, the ability for control, the moral and legal distinction is one that has cost from stocking and accumulating these kind of things. So when individuals are stocking and accumulating chemical weapons, they know that they're going to be clamped down. So an incentive not to stock, accumulate, reduce, increases, right? But even if we are not able to stop everyone, because we know the likes of Russia, China, US will still be stocking, but smaller countries or other countries are disincentivized from doing this. So at least you have some level of regulation existing within those wars. If you say you do not like wars, right, you should never be okay with things that incentivize wars. I forgot to even write this in my note, right? Things that necessarily incentivize wars from happening within those spaces. I will engage that later within my speech. Why is this important? And Ghost didn't engage this well. The limitation on the amount of innovation is what necessarily happens in our world, and that's why we like it. What do innovations look like to chemical weapons in and of themselves? Just like normal weaponry, the reason we have lethal autonomous weapons, before this will come and shout at me again, the reason we have lethal autonomous weapons in the world we live in is because of the proliferation of normal weaponry in and of themselves, right? Lethal autonomous weapons are things that cause massive asymmetrical warfare in the world we live in and can cause harm to a lot of people. But secondly, they give massive incentives for people to go to war, because there's easier way of killing individuals and getting becoming the victory within those particular spaces. What do these innovations look like? They look like the production of weapons that are not just weapons of massive destruction, because chemical weapons already do that. Things like chemicals that can stay in the air for the next 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, and cannot fade. Because while you massively use things, the incentive to increase the harms that those things perpetuate is very, very important, right? And this is something that Ghost did not engage within his speech, right? So the restriction that we give is what prevents this innovations that exist within these things. Why are the innovations harmful? And even when they're not innovations, why are they harmful? There is an overlapping consensus of what wars should look like to be legal, because we understand that we can never stop wars. The reason wars in the vast majority of instances are deemed moral is because of the ability for the both countries, the both parties post the war, to exist and to rise again. The reason we term the war in Libya largely illegitimate is because United States of America left Libya in a state where they can most likely not even come up again. blockade. But to some extent, it's more legitimate than looking like chemical weapons, because at the end of the day, at least people still exist. With chemical weapons, you wipe out people existing. So it looks like wiping out everybody existing in Kiev, including Zelensky. So after the war in Ukraine, Ukraine cannot grow because Kiev is the major source of like growth within Ukraine, right? But you're wiping out the entire society, creating scenarios where you can also massively wipe out an entire society, the ability of countries to not exist, because we know that people can be extremely radical and do these things and extremely illogical because they think they potentially have power. In a world where we want countries to exist because of one, globalization, and like the concept of gaining from every single country, we should never and never agree for like things that will ensure countries do not exist and do not grow, and largely illegal warfare in and of themselves. This is the reason we support this, because it has largely prevented these things from happening. Look at World War II. They used all those things because necessarily they didn't want countries to exist. That's why chemical weapons were used, right? Not because they want to create some level of deterrence, but they don't want countries to exist again. The reason chemical weapons exist, they're weapons of massive destruction, right? But secondly, the ability of countries to like protect themselves, right? See, if you use chemical weapon, you risk other people from using chemical weapons on you. So this restriction means you prevent those things happening. We think the concept of mutually assured destruction is something that should like prevent countries from doing things. But in large majority of instances, when you have this military equipment, you don't think of mutually assured destruction. Example, like Russia. So it looks like this. Russia uses chemical weapons on themselves, and then the US uses chemical weapons on Russia massively. Everybody in Ukraine and Russia do not exist. So you are looking like two countries that are massively bastardized, two countries that control the world economy, massively bastardized, leading to trickle-down effect of other world economies in and of themselves, right? We don't want wars like warfare to exist within states. But secondly, you increase the concept of asymmetrical warfare that exists within states, because not every country can get these chemical weapons in and of themselves, right? The reason we would clash US from invading Nigeria or fighting with Nigeria is asymmetrical warfare. The reason there was a clash when like Russia massively bombed a place in Kiev and the threat was literally asymmetrical is because of that thing. Like those things morally exist within wars. You increase these things, reducing the ability for people to exist. Final, as world bodies who should serve as protection to minorities, countries that cannot fight, is it legitimate to create policies that will protect them? We think yes. There's less incentive for people to go to war. There's more incentive for people to go to war in your own world where they have chemicals of mass destruction, asymmetrical warfare, and things like this. We went from CEO.
Can I be heard? Can I start? Starting in speaker, closing opposition and opening opposition just ended the debate by giving us all of the harms of the use of chemical or biological weapons, right? We think that these harms are harms that we agree to. That's the problem. But we think that these harms are harms that more or less also exist with the use of conventional weapons. That is why we think that any moral or legal condemnations of the use of chemical weapons should be all encompassing and should also encompass the harms that conventional weapons has, right? It means that whatever sort of sanctions we are going to make against these kinds of things should be totally stick and what have you. My first speech showed you how there is a significant array of harms with the use of conventional weapons, how they are easier to use, more accessible, and have led to more carnal destruction than chemical weapons within status quo, and how this this distinction is going to continually legitimize the deaths of all the people that have died thanks to conventional weapons. Closing opposition says four things. The first is that their world is going to lead down to clamping down on countries that are stocking and accumulating chemical weapons. We think that this does not in any way disincentivize anyone from going to wars, right? Because we think that within status quo, people have gone to wars with conventional weapons. We have seen missiles, landmines, all produced conventionally, and they have led to so much carnal destruction that they have to justify why all of these things can be condoned, but then chemical weapons cannot, right? But then they tell you that they want to place a limitation on the amount of innovation in regards to research on chemical weapons. We agree with them again, but we think also that there is a significant limitation that we also have to prove on research in regards to missiles and all conventional weapons, right? Why is that the case? Because we think that they all kill people, right? It means that whether or not we kill one person or we kill two people, we have to be looking for ways to ensure that there is a total clamp down on these kinds of things. The next thing is that people are more incentivized to go into war when they have chemical weapons because it's an easier way of killing people. We again think that this is something that they are unable to prove because we think that people go into war these days even when they have no chemical weapons. But then more importantly, they concede significantly that people like the US and larger countries are still going to engage in research and those kinds of things with regards to chemical weapons and those kinds of things. But then they're going to climb down on people like Syria when Syria uses or develops chemical weapons. We think that this is something that is principally unbalanced and is tantamount to oppression. But more importantly, we think that in the worst case scenarios, because from Gulf we have like wars, we support a narrative where we condemn every weapons of warfare. But then in the worst case scenario where wars still happen, where you significantly clamp down on smaller states who, the only sort of weaponry that they have are weapons that they develop within their labs and those kinds of things, right? Because understand that, with chemical weapons and those kinds of things, it's easier to do research within labs and those kinds of things, right? With other weapons, you possibly have to go and buy from Switzerland or what have you, right? It means that in instances where, in the worst case scenario, these guys go into wars, because you have clamped them down and restricted the ability to use chemical weapons, which is the only thing they have access to and they have. What happens is that you simply make the world less symmetric, right? Because larger countries who have access and money to be able to buy all the conventional weapons at their disposal are still going to clamp down on these people, kill as many people, lead to the sort of extinction that you are speaking of in your world, right? But then they hate chemical weapons because they wipe out society. So think that weapons in and of themselves kill people, and when you kill people, the society is going to get slimmer and slimmer, right? It means that whether it's conventional or chemical, we are still going to do all of these kinds of things, right? But then the one different thing the one thing opening opposition says that closing opposition does not regurgitate is how it is harder for conflict resolution, right? Because people are less likely to want to come to the conversation table when they see that a lot of their people have been killed in hugely gruesome manners. We think that this is untrue because when there is a bomb blast, there are no chemical weapons used. But then we are going to see members of our family who are going to be dismembered and those kinds of things. It means that if we are going to have any sort of anger and aggression that is going to make us not want to have any discussions with regards to conflict resolution, they are still going to happen regardless, right? At the end of the day, what do we tell you that is very important? We think that we do not support a world where there is some sort of condoning, right? Whether it is marginal or not, of the use of weaponry and of itself. It means that we say that wars are legitimate when this is done or when this is not. Our society, our cumulative moral stance has to be one that says that, we're entirely against the use of the use of weapons, right? We can say that we are against the use of weapons because of how they harm our societies generally, right? How they cause wars and those kinds of things are all things that society can take a cumulative moral stance upon. At the end of the day, what is the distinction that will give you and why do we win above our opponent? We think that while they do a significantly good job, we think that the differentiation that we give you, which is very important with regards to this debate, is on what that counterfactual particularly looks like, right? Because they say, they think that wars can happen and those kinds of things. We tell you that no, we want a world where there is a continual discouragement of people or entities from going into war in and of themselves. When society has a continual, opposition stance to the use of wars in themselves, we think that this is a more moral stance because that is what society should be about. We against the world where any sort of harms against citizens is something that is legitimized because it is not nuclearized or chemicalized. We are proud to win.
No one is calling us out, so I presume I can start. I can start, yeah? All right. 3, 2, 1, go. Panel, on incentive to go to war. The reason countries want to go to war is because they know that they would win. Chemical weapons are weapons of mass destruction. What it means fundamentally is that when you know you can get to a lot of people, because what you look at
be widespread and cause harms to a wide variety of individuals. But secondly, is the fact that they don't just cause harm, they cause significant harms that stay for a long period of time. And the impact is what I give you in my speech, because not equal to just the cause harms that stay for a long period of time. Things that will prevent these countries from existing in and of themselves, from being able to grow, because you've harmed their manpower, because lots of them are now suffering from cerebral malfunctions, lungs disease, unable to breathe. But in many instances, when there is like some development into these chemical weapons, it could transcend to stopping vegetations from existing within those places. So you can't even live, you can't grow things there, you can't build houses that may even stay. Those are what innovations look like. Like when you get weapons, you look for innovations that make them to be the greatest. Are there chemicals that can cause those fundamental problems? Yes, all you need is those particular levels of innovations and like investigations into them, right? You limit those things when you create an incentive for them not to use it. Because why would I waste money on like investigating and like improving chemical weapons when I'll most likely not use it at the end of the day, right? When I'll be sanctioned from using it, right? Or when I'm one of the custodians that say you shouldn't use those chemical weapons in and of themselves. So those things largely do not happen, and that's why it's okay within our world, right? Gulf's alternative is to make wars illegal, right? First, we think we prefer using something that is most probable. The people who want to make wars illegal are the ones who will fight the most wars, the United States of America, etc., etc. So it wouldn't still happen. What they know they can do is to make chemical weapons illegal and immoral, because they know they can stick to that at least to some extent. So at the end of the day, we still get some level of marginal benefits because we limit harm in and of themselves. It goes to opening government. Very laughable. They say you legitimize wars. No link to how you legitimize wars in and of themselves, right? Because you don't necessarily. And also within my speech, I explained how some wars are seen to be very, very immoral in and of themselves when they are largely asymmetrical, right? So you call them very immoral warfare. So you don't necessarily like make wars immoral. We think that even chemical weapons are more asymmetrical in and of themselves, cannot be controlled, and all those kind of things, right? Why do we necessarily win? We tell you that there are laws surrounding warfare in and of themselves. It means that these wars mean that they allow people to fight warfare, right? And don't clamp down so much because one, they cannot, but secondly, they know that after these wars, at least leave them in a state where they can still grow and still exist. Because countries are interlinked, economies are interlinked. You always need those countries and those economies to grow, right? You will need to trade with them, etc. But secondly, when you wipe out an entire world, an entire group of individuals, you are largely immoral in yourself, right? Because that wiping down is not the thing that would actually make you win. Like you can do some minimal harms and still win that war potentially. So as long as there is this rule governing warfare and the use of chemical weapons, the development of chemical weapons are ones that go against those rules governing warfare, it means it's then important for these policies to exist. And that's why we support those policies that create those distinctions. One, because we cannot stop warfare in general, but secondly, there are laws governing warfare, and the best way to solve them is by limiting certain use of certain things. That is why people are clamping down on the use of lethal autonomous weapons. One, because they can cause massive harm, but they're even better than chemical weapons because they don't cause as much harm as chemical weapons. Because when you talk about chemical weapons, when you fire a lethal autonomous weapon, it's attacking a particular group of individuals, right? So like one place and bombs one place. Chemical weapon can, when you mistakenly fire a chemical weapon, you can cover an entire state and end that entire state, end the the vegetations, everything existing in that entire state. It could be as similar to the Hiroshima blast, right? Because you can develop weapons that are similar to even nuclear weapons in and of themselves. If they're very harmful, you should stop it. Shoot, Raymond.
So the
Mascot.
problem is that even when we agree that okay, there are significantly more like casualties in chemical weapons, like I showed you, it's proportional, right? I've showed you that. But even when we agree with this, what you are doing is that you say, oh, this is okay when wars are fought and fewer people die, right? We think that we should say no, we don't want you to use weapons and kill a lot of people at all.
Stop it now. Panel, listen. Who is more logical? The team that talks about a more realistic solution. They don't show you how you can stop warfare in general, and I showed you how you can't stop warfare in general because there are many people that can do this. But the thing that they will mostly accept, because at the end of the day, we have to come to a consensus, right? No, let's not say lethal weapon. Let's say you shouldn't use anything. People will use both chemical weapons and both normal weapons, right? So you can't regulate anything, but this is what you can regulate more, and that's why it is more important. So control is very, very necessary. We talked about asymmetrical warfare, and not every single individual can get this. But secondly, we need to protect highly irrational actors, like people like Putin that wouldn't care about his country and use chemical weapons. That at the end of the day, someone like US will fire more chemical weapons and harm people of Russia. When actors within countries can be radically irrational and cause harm to their people, limit the extent to which you cause harm, especially to innocent individuals. Limit the concept of asymmetrical warfare because not everybody can get it. So you are seen as a moral actor that needs to protect and everything, because it's mostly done by countries like the United States, and then United Nations attempts to protect other individuals. We particularly win from closing opposition.
Beautiful. Thank you, Opposition, for those remarks. I don't know if I was audible after Raymond's speech. Probably my network. Yeah, thank you everyone for the final round, and that wrap up the finals. Thank you very much. Educators, please let's jump into education briefing room.